in, so that's good.
Yeah.
Merci, Sandra. Thank you, Sandra. So yes, I'd like to welcome you all. I know it's been so long, but yes, it's almost we're getting there. We're going to be meeting in person. I can guarantee, but give us another few months. Anyway, before we get started, and before I introduce Brian and Anwar, I'd like to read the usual recognition of the territories. So, as we're not all gathered in the same space, we recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you're currently on. And I understand that some people are really far from here. Si c'est le cas, nous vous demandons de prendre la responsabilité de reconnaître le territoire traditionnel sur lequel vous vous trouvez et les titulaires actuels du traité. We recognize that many indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. Glendon, en tant que partie intégrante de l'Université York, reconnaît sa présence sur le territoire traditionnel de nombreuses nations autochtones. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and it is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And this territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Donc, merci à nos deux invités. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Anwar, for coming here today to share your research. I'm almost sure that everybody knows Brian, even if we don't see him as often as we used to now that he's retired. But what an idea.
I like the wave of the hand with the retired.
Yes, you went.
Just kind of fly away.
That was exactly what I wanted to convene. And thank you to Anwar, who's been working with Brian. Anwar, you were telling me that you are a coordinator, the coordinator of ESL, the ESL section at DLLL on the main campus of York University, the Kiel campus, as we call it. Brian, you were in charge of the ESL program at Glendon, and I understand that you've been working together on, and I just want to make sure that I get your title right, Postmemory, Effect, and Multilingual Identity in Language Teaching, a Duoethnography. And it is a topic that is really, really something that a lot of people are talking about right now at university and in research. And I was talking to Anwar, and we do have to gather more of our colleagues to talk about plurilingualism and identity. So before I start saying something stupid, I'd rather let Brian talk. And Brian, you're the one with the PowerPoint, I understand.
Yeah, so if you could just give me the sharing capacity. Anyways, thank you very much, Sylvie, for the invitation for us to come present our work. Can everybody see that?
It's wonderful. We can all see it. Yes.
Okay, good. So, as Sylvie said, this presentation is based on a paper that Anwar and I recently published in the Language Learning Journal, and it was on a special issue of multilingual identity. So one of the key aspects of the paper is the research method, duoethnography. And hopefully Anwar and I can use some of the interactivity in our presentation that's kind of featured in the paper. I noticed in the audience there's several people that I've done duo and multi-ethnographies with before, Ian, and I see Huberval Maciel there. And it's an interesting research method, and we're going to talk a bit about why why it's really appropriate for the content of this presentation. Okay. Now here is, we'll start off with a few key concepts from our paper. One of the first ones in the title is the idea of post-memory, from Marianne Hirsch. So it's interesting to see this idea of intergenerational transfer of often traumatic experiences. But Anwar and I yesterday were talking about how did we get an interest in this topic. My own kind of experience of it was through two people. I noticed Andrea Matos from Belo Horizonte in Brazil is here today, and she, I think a couple years ago, got me interested and involved in first reading about Hirsch's work. And it also reminded me of work I did as a graduate student at OISE. One of my dissertation supervisors on my committee was Roger Simon. And it was at an interesting time that he was changing his focus more towards pedagogies of commemoration. How does one remember and teach and commemorate difficult knowledges and traumatic experience? So that was kind of my background. I should ask Anwar to share how he got interested in this topic.
Thanks, Brian, and hi, everyone. Thanks for your interest in our paper and our talk. I got interested in post-memory through my reading of Zimbalist, an educational researcher, a professor, a prolific writer on affect theory, affect and emotion studies in education. So I got to know about this concept, like popularized by Hirsch, but I learned it through Zimbalist. So like he's based in Cyprus. So yeah, he's a well-known researcher. So yeah, that was my my starting point. And then I also, I mean, I will talk more about this, but I thought I found it interesting to understand my own post-memory of language and identity. So I'll wait for a few minutes to talk more about that. So okay. I'll let you continue, Brian.
So here's the second point that on our PowerPoint, a little bit about the broader context of post-memory is in memory studies, and how it links up with various areas around Holocaust studies, archival development of suppressed histories. There's been truth and reconciliation commissions in Canada, Chile, South Africa. So one of the things that's been a key interest for Anwar and I in this research, looking at these kinds of fields of memory studies, are the kinds of questions that look at why, where, and how do people choose to remember and forget, and why, how, and where is memory invoked or provoked. And so in these kinds of fields, and these are the kinds of interesting things that emerge out of transdisciplinary study. And we're particularly interested in to what extent does this work outside the field of applied linguistics and language teaching? What is its relevance specifically for the work we do in additional language teaching? So that's been kind of our focus in our paper. And we will get to this later. One of the key things that arises out of our interest in applied linguistics and language teaching is there are important complicating factors for multilingual identity, we believe, that arise from post-memory and affect. And we'll be talking a bit more about that later. Okay, so another key issue or a key topic and theme is affect and emotion. Now it's interesting, I can't say in other people in the Glendon community what's happened, but in our field, there's been lots of evidence of what could be called an affective turn. There's been really important books on emotion in language teaching, particularly the work of Sarah Benish. And she's done work on emotions in language teacher education. There's a nice quote from Matthew Pryor that I know Anwar found this, and it kind of sums up, if you're in the work of language and you think about how important affect is and the role of language in mediating and communicating emotion and affect, it has to become a part of the study. The question is, how do we make it relevant in a field internal way? One of the challenges that we've talked about is, and not just on affect, is the issue of to what extent is field external theory, and I'm thinking particularly of affect theory, to what extent is it not relevant for the kinds of priorities for field internal concerns? And when you start to look at affect theory, it can be really complex. There's even, when you look at some of the work by Brian Masumi, who's the translator of Deleuze and Guattari's work, he comes from what a form of an inside-out form of thinking of affect, where affect is distinctive from emotion. And he's very, very adamant that emotion reflects a linguistic containment or desensitize, or he looks at how it controls and contains intensity, and the visceral intensity that he sees as central to affect. So it's interesting for us, we talk about that. Is that kind of theory, to what extent, where it disconnects itself from emotion, relevant for the kind of work we're doing? Anwar, anything you wanted to add to that?
Sure. If you could just go to the next point, I think it would be
yes.
helpful. Yeah. So thanks. Yeah, as Brian was saying, this idea of affect, it is interesting, but at the same time, I find it difficult to make sense of different approaches to the study of affect. And for me, it was an interesting time. I was a graduate student at WESI, 2011 to 16. So those 4 or 5 years, like, there was a lot of activity in affect theory, affect studies. And like many, I was drawn to these affect studies. And at the same time, I was confused. I was reading different traditions of affect studies. In Western tradition, most scholars would probably start with Spinoza and, Brian Masumi. And then I was grappling with this problem of affect as being pre-linguistic, and me coming from a language studies perspective, and then trying to come to terms with affect, which is beyond language or pre-linguistic, what some people would call it. And then how do we make sense of it, like in our language teaching and research? So if it is not representatable through language, then how do we talk about it? So that was like one of my challenges. And then I also noticed that some other affect scholars were using affect and emotion interchangeably, without worrying too much about the differences and similarities. So Sarah Ahmed did it sometimes. And for my work in critical applied linguistics or transformative, pedagogy, I found Sarah Ahmed very, very helpful, because her cultural studies approach was kind of opposed to both the traditional psychological model of emotion, where like it's inside out, like we are like emotions are our own internal property, and then I am responsible for my own emotion, and emotion resides within me, and then I just bring it out through language. So that's the traditional dominant psychological and also philosophical approach. And then later we also have this sociological and anthropological approach, where you see emotions are socially constructed. It's kind of outside us, and then we internalize through language and various social factors. So what Sarah Ahmed would call like outside in. So when we go to a funeral, for example, the affective atmosphere will transmit certain kinds of emotion towards us, and then we'll be affected by that atmosphere. So more kind of like a sociological approach. So Sarah Ahmed came up with this, her own cultural studies model, which was neither inside out nor outside in, because for her, it's like the boundary between like inside and outside is constructed throughout our, like constructed by our affective encounter. So it's not like something pre-existing. So I found that that's very interesting, and I based on Ahmed's work and also critical literacy work that we have, like mostly like the Prairian tradition of critical literacy. So I developed this sort of like a pedagogical framework in a paper that I published in 2016. So as you can see on the screen, so I was trying to develop an affective approach to my own pedagogy by looking at these four pedagogical principles that I call these. So first of all, like why we feel what we feel. So again, going back to Ahmed's work, it's like there are multiple actors in our affective encounter. It's not only us. And then, I mean, in the interest of time, I'm trying to give you like a very brief overview here. Probably we can come back to some of these points later if we have time. Number two is a very difficult task, at least I believe so, is this: how do we enter a relation of affective equivalence? If you think about the state of our world and then all the sufferings of people, and then how we kind of, we have to borrow from Butler, probably, like a differential distribution of affective emotion, attention. So we don't feel the same way for the distant, for the unknown, the same way we would feel for the people around us, our family, our friends, our colleagues, our students, right? So there's clearly a schism between those who are close to us and those who are distant from us. And then next point is, then how do we interrogate the production and circulation of objects of emotion in our everyday life, in our classroom, in our politics, in all spheres of our social life? Because some objects of emotions are stickier than others. Like some objects stick to us in different ways. And then finally, like, how do we understand the performativity of emotions in order to achieve social justice? So these were my starting point, actually, both in my teaching and research in this area. I'll let Brian speak, and then probably I'll come back again.
Okay, let's go on. The next key concept in the paper is the research method we used, and as I mentioned earlier, I've done this with others, and Anwar and I have done this, explored this research method with others as well, Huberval Maciel and Ian Martin. Norris and Sawyer are credited as the initiators of this approach. It's challenging. It asks us to attempt to suspend prior beliefs, to engage in dialogue, to take risks. And I'm going to share a few of the quotes you can have a look at that Norris and Sawyer use. That gives you an idea of the aspirations. So a couple of the key things from this is the juxtaposition of text. So participants in the Duoethnography are transparent. Their voices are in the text. There isn't a necessary emphasis on reaching consensus. In fact, There's an encouragement to seek out differences. The differences become the source of insights on things that perhaps you took for granted. And this is something that Anwar and I were talking about the other day, is that that's perhaps a particular strength of or relevance of duoethnography for a study of post-memory and affect. In some ways, that kind of content area or topic area, we're too close to, we're too emotionally entangled and engaged to have the opportunity to step back and to see how things like memory and affect are mobilized, and sometimes in traumatic ways, but also in current politics. So the opportunity of juxtaposing and exploring things being said in this context, and in the spirit of what Norris and Sawyer ask us to do, I think is particularly relevant. Anwar, anything you want to add to that?
Sure. I agree, and I think, and that's like one of the reasons why I became so interested in this methodology. I mean, partly because I thought it was a really good response to the like canonical ways of doing research that we have been used to, in mainstream journal articles, like all this traditional 5 sections research paper with almost predictable answers to the questions that we see in the introduction section of journal articles. Like, we can almost see what's coming. In duoethnography, I like this ambivalence and this learning to deal with and live with this ambivalence in our social and pedagogical work, where things are not always predictable. So I think duoethnography teaches me to do that, just to and also, especially for memory work, the nexus between memory, post-memory, and linguistic identities. I think it's interesting because our memories, we would like to think that our memories are reliable, and we who wouldn't think otherwise, but our memories are not always reliable. It could be misleading, and post memories too, right? So then how do we understand our own memories and also our post memories with a linear model of research which is predictable? And so the honesty, the ambivalence, and unpredictability that duoethnography nurtures, I think, is great.
Yeah. I'm going to go on.
Excuse me, can I just ask a really
Sure.
direct question,
Yeah.
because it was new to me. Which 2 ethnographies are you talking about? Which, I'm not quite clear. Duoethnography are 2?
So it builds on the idea of an autoethnography. Ethnography, the principles of ethnography, the emic perspective. The duoethnography is when 2 participants engage in dialogue with each other. And the third bullet point kind of lays this, in contrast to autoethnography, duoethnography locates the researcher differently. It is ultimately not about the self. So autoethnography is to see how different people are positioned in relationship to a common phenomenon, object, or experience. And so what ends up happening is that you start to see things that you've taken for granted, or perhaps are subconscious or unconscious, which is really in the domains of emotion and affect in many ways. And then you hope for the conversation. I mean, it's the ideal, becomes a means of seeing how your experiences, different experiences, illuminate perhaps the source or cause of the situation.
Okay.
Thanks, Brian.
So rather than sorry, go ahead, Anwar.
Yeah, if I may add a little bit to what you're saying, the self of autoethnography is challenged in really unique and interesting ways in duoethnography, because there's one potential problem in autoethnography is this could be sort of like a blind spot, like how we understand ourself and how the self understands things, right? So almost there is no challenge coming to our self understanding in autoethnography, because I'm the one who is trying to make sense of things. But in duoethnography, that our self is constantly being challenged by our research partner.
Okay, let's go on. The next slide is we're going to both kind of talk about backgrounds, how we came to this topic and how we came to this paper. My own background is related to a course I teach at Glendon, or I used to teach at Glendon, called Dealing with Viewpoint. I think it was originally created by David Cook. Gosh, Ian would know how many years ago this was. I'm not sure. Yeah, so it's quite a while back. And it was probably the most advanced course in EAP, English for Academic Purposes. It dealt with the building blocks of rhetoric in academic writing, argumentation, expository writing, critique, critical analysis, discourse analysis. When I came to the course, one of the things I wanted to expand on was the idea of visual rhetoric. It was at a time in the late 2000s where interest in multimodality was happening. There was also a new social semiotic informed visual grammar. And I found a chapter in which was really accessible to students. So what ended up happening is I created this assignment, a culture jamming assignment. Students had a meta language to apply to it, similar to the kind of language they understood argumentation, but it was done with visual argumentation. And so you see on the left, they would have to find an image, a culture jamming image, either online or out in the street, linguistic landscape example. And the kinds of prompts for their small writing assignment was, does this work? How does it work on you? How do the resources made, similar as you look at any kind of discourse analysis, what were the semiotic visual resources used to move you, to position you, to attract you? And out of this, this was kind of my interest in this kind of connection of post-memory affect and what orients us to or away from different images. Now, these two are also kind of interesting ones that I want to share with you. The one on the right is back from 2000. It was the cover of iMagazine. That used to be a weekly entertainment magazine. It's a picture of Mike Harris. Notice the interesting use of digraphia, the mixing of scripts, and how that might have what I would call a distributed causality for different audiences based on your literacy history. The one on the left is also intriguing in terms of my own post-memory. Half of my family is from maybe 150 years ago. No, 120, I have to say, are from the Ukraine. And notice the poster was from a rally in front of Queen's Park, I think 2010 or 11, protesting. The protest was against a coalition of opposition parties planning to remove a vote of no confidence against the government at the time. Jack Layton, the man on the right, the late Jack Layton, was the leader of the New Democrats. For me, this poster was very provocative. You notice again the interesting use of digraphia, of Cyrillic characters. And I mean, there's many Slavic and Turkic languages that use Cyrillic. And notice like the A in Canada, I think, could be seen approximating the D sound, the D in Russian or Ukrainian. You've got that thing that looks like an O, is like, I think it's the phonetic F sound. And then you've got the R and the N. The N, I think, is a vowel. But when you look at that from, if you're Ukrainian, and this is, as we know now from the conflict, the war and the invasion, we know that this is one of the largest Ukrainian communities outside of the Ukraine is in Canada. You see this in many levels. You see it at information level, but you also see in the context of post-memory of the Holodomor, the forced Stalin starvation of Ukrainians in the 30s. So there's many meanings going on in these images, and you see the complexity of the resources put into that. So these are the kinds of things I would bring into class to help students with their assignment. Now, this is what we talk about in the paper. This is kind of my own interesting emotion and affect experience of interacting with text. Bagel World, I think, is on Wilson, not far from the main campus. So the first time I saw this, I was kind of, wow, look at that. Look at that sign. And what was so interesting for me was several things. First, you see the Hebrew letter Shin as a substitute for W, the Hebrew Dalaf, the D sound, stylistically, the Hebrew Mem, for an M sound in Hebrew, stylistically suggesting the D. So there was many ways to read this, and there's a fabulous article and lab of someone who teaches at York, Dejan Iskovic. And he talks about the semiotics of multilingualism, and he collects a lot of these kinds of images. And so he talks about the multiple polysemy, the multiple levels of meaning and the engagement with different people. You have this first order denotation of Bagel World. You've got an indexical, and I'm using the terminology of Charles Saunders Peirce, Peircean semiotics. A second order that is pointing to another kind of meaning or feeling. And in this case, the way I read that is the Bagel World sign suggests to me an authenticity. These aren't just any bagels. These are really good Montreal Jewish bagels. This is a place to go. So there's this other level of meaning. Then there was, for me, a third order, a thirdness of post-memory affect. And part of that was growing up in Regina and being part of a minority Jewish community on my dad's side. And all the work that goes into trying to maintain a community from not being assimilated by the dominant community. And there's a fabulous article that we used to read in my language and identity class called Faith, Phonics, and Identity. And reading this article, I said, yes, this is part of how affect and post-memory around literacies happen for me. Because he talks about a particular kind of literacy, which is devotional literacy, a lot of rote learning, phonics. And the purpose of it, he says, is vestigial memory. So the idea is this kind of recitation out loud. Recitation of religious texts, and in this article he talks about also Quran, and that this kind of a literacy in a way is part of my literacy experience and my post-memory of when I look at texts like Bagel World is part of the conditioning of how this Torah and rote learning of devotional literacies affected me. So this is something that Anwar and I talk about in our text. And compare, because it became an object of comparing literacies and literacy experiences. So here's Anwar's story. I'll turn it over to him.
Oh, thanks, Brian. My story, see, I was thinking about like how, I mean, I told some stories in the paper, but for our talk today, I was thinking about like this quote from this classic book, The Poetics of Space, by Gaston Bachelard. I don't know how to say the last name, but anyway. So as you can see in this brief quote, you know, this relation between place, language, memory, identity, and how the place we are born into, like the house where we are born in, and how that gets inscribed in us, in our identity and memory, and also post-memory. So I thought this is a good quote to tell you my story. So I'll just let you take a look at the quote without me trying to explain what it means. And then Brian, if you could go to the next slide, please.
Okay.
Thank you. Now, a couple of weeks ago, almost 3 weeks ago, we celebrated International Mother Language Day on the 21st of February. Now, since 1999, we have been celebrating this internationally to emphasize the need to preserve and promote all languages in the world. And the idea of celebrating an International Mother Language Day came from Bangladesh, where I'm from. And we have a history, and I have post-memories of that history. So when Bangladesh was part of Pakistan, like one of the provinces of Pakistan, after the formal end of the British Empire in Indian subcontinent, those of you who know the history. So in 1947, so what is now Bangladesh became part of Pakistan, but Pakistan was divided, like geographically divided by India. So the whole country of India was in between two parts of Pakistan, which was a crazy idea. But, and then we had, like in East Pakistan, which is again now Bangladesh, we had issues with the West Pakistan over language, like national language. And even though we were the majority in East Pakistan and our language was Bengali or Bangla as we call it, but we were denied our rights to our mother tongue and education in mother tongue and also like for official purposes, like we had to use Urdu, the dominant language from West Pakistan. Anyway, long story short, in 1952, people, especially university students, professors, academics, and also people from other sectors, they took to the street, protested this unjust imposition of Urdu language, and then many people in the protest were killed by the government, by the police and military, and that was on the February 21st in 1952. So since then, we commemorate, we remember the language martyrs, as we call them, like language movement, like activists. And that was the beginning of our independence. And then ultimately, we had to fight a long war with our own government, central government in West Pakistan. In 1971, we got independent. And then that's when we became a nation state, like an independent sovereign nation state with a strong language-based identity. Even the name of the language and name of the country. So Bangla was the name of the language and Bangladesh is the name of the country. So Bangla and Desh means country, literally. So Bangla plus country. So you can see like how our national identity and our linguistic identity were like so close. And then, so all these are my post-memory, but like anyone in my age group, like we feel like it's our own memory. We almost feel, because every year, like the way we celebrated, it was like almost like a so sacred, like almost like a religious level, like the way we remember those who were killed during this language movement in 1952. And then interestingly, like after the independence in 1971, when we, I mean, all these years, we still had the influence of English from the British colonial period, like pre-1947. So English was there, not as an official language, but as a dominant language. Many people, especially from the upper class, middle class, like they would still learn English in private schools and also in government schools as well. So, and then after the independence, when we kind of got rid of Urdu, but there was like increasing influence of English, and then how that our very own identity and pride in mother tongue that we achieved I would argue that language pride was shattered to some extent by this domination of English, and then how in subsequent decades, how English as a dominant global language has impacted our education policy, our social prestige of the people who are able to speak English, employment opportunities, everything. So I thought that was, and that actually made me think about language and identity. So that's another reason why I got interested in this research. Brian, could you go to the next slide, please?
The highlights?
Oh, okay. Sorry. So maybe that's okay. We can just we can
go back to the
go back, or probably stay here. That's fine. We can stay here. So the language pride that I was talking about, and then how I experienced language shame in contrast in my English language courses when I was trying to learn English back in Bangladesh. And then, so this contrast and this from pride and shame and other emotions as well associated with learning a foreign language, in this case, English. So the memories, post memories of language pride, and then memories of language shame had a lasting impact on me and my own plurilingual identity, which I discussed to some extent in the article. And then when so Brian and I, were thinking about our research and writing the paper, I asked this question, like, how does an individual identify themselves during and after learning a new language? So that was my question, because I thought that learning a new language, yes, it is a gain, but can it also be a loss on an affective level? Like, and if so, what kind of loss we're talking about here? And then Brian turned around this question and asked this. So I'll let Brian speak about this question. Probably.
Yeah, and it really was a real kind of duoethnographic experience, because when Anwar posed the question, the first thing that came to my mind was growing up in the early 60s, and both parents coming from familial homes where the familial language was not English. My dad's language at home was Yiddish, and my mom's language was Ukrainian. Both parents, and my dad came from a real poor working class family in Saskatoon, and my mom's family originally came from farmers, first white settler homesteaders in Saskatchewan. Neither of them would speak their home language in front of the kids. They had bought into the belief at the time, the language ideology, that if you do that, there's not enough room in your children's brain to succeed, and you must only speak English, maximum exposure. And that was my upbringing. So very sad. And then one of the things I noticed from that, especially because I have Ukrainian relatives in Saskatoon, is that you feel the shame of being almost like an imposter, because if you're at a wedding or at an event or even a conversation, you hear it, you think, I'm not there. It's a gap, and you start to see this. And then you start, yeah, that's part of my identity. So it's this loss. It's like this palimpsest where you scratch off the surface, but it's never gone away. The fact that there's a Ukrainian identity there, but it's missing that sense, the belonging that the language provides. So interesting. This is one of, we had highlights that we've brought out a few of them. Let me go to the second one. We were really interested in this idea of the politics of emotion. And so as I showed a couple of those examples of those posters on the iMagazine, that this is an aspect that doesn't get covered in our teaching very much. Symbolic competence. We're really about reason, rationality, evidence-based rhetoric. And in some ways, how are we denying students the reality of the highly effective, affective, emotional world outside the classroom? Anwar, is anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure. Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so symbolic competence is one of our favorite concepts here in the paper. And I said this, like, why we should encourage our affective literacies in our classroom. In for example, in my case, it is a EAP teaching, and because I think this is very important at this point when we have students from different parts of the world with different histories, with different types of post memories, and diverse experiences of mobility, migration, and all sorts of different experiences that our students bring to our classroom. And then how do we understand, again, going back to our like the special issue that our paper was a part of, like this multilingual identity? Because I mean, we know from research, like, in identity work, not only in our field, but in anthropology, for example, and other disciplines, like there is a tendency to, obscure differences among the members of the in-group, right? Like usually we try to, use an identity level, and we attempt to obscure the differences because we take it for granted and think, okay, so all these people belong to this identity category. And at the same time, we also amplify or, manufacture sometimes, like differences between those who belong to one group and then those who belong to another group. So that's a problem that I think we have in research on identity. Now, and when we use this level of multilingual identity, then how do we deal with that kind of tendency of either blurring the differences or sometimes creating the differences among people, which are probably non-existent? So for that reason, and also to develop this kind of symbolic competence that our students need in super diverse contexts like ours here, like where multiple languages and identities are always, at work. So I for that reason, I thought like a critical affective literacy approach to teaching and learning could be helpful. So Brian, if you could go to the next slide.
Let's go to the third example from our duoethnography, and it's
okay.
In a discussion of pedagogical spaces.
Right. So as I was saying, that we probably need to create a new kind of pedagogical spaces where, we can support our students, help them, not only construct new identities, but understand the identities, like multiple identities that they bring with them to the classroom. So this is an example from one of my students, like when in that course, I was trying to promote this kind of affective engagement with students' identity. And this was one student, she was an immigrant, a refugee coming from a war-torn country, lived in a transition country for a few years, and then finally came to Canada. And now, she was taking one of my courses, and that's how she was telling her story in a multimodal assignment. So this is part of her multimodal work. So I just, I got her permission to share her experience here. So, I'm thinking about how much of her story I should share with you. But so in a nutshell, she was, through this painting, she was trying to tell us, like the whole class, and also during her presentation, like how, like her, not only her trajectory, her journey, but also her attachment to the land, to the place, like her school. At the bottom of this, like the left side of this picture, you see, like that was her school, and then how this multimodal, affective, transsemiotic work enabled her, supported her to share her experience, and then how she felt empowered. And as I said in this sentence, that how it almost like helped her mobilize, affective resources to, what I said, like to do incredible things and to speak the truth, to borrow from Foucault. So how we, like the courage to speak the truth. So that was a really interesting and a good learning experience for me as an educator in that classroom. So Brian, would you like to add?
Yeah, and
something?
my response, because in the article, one of the things I did is use some of the Kress and Van Leuven multimodal visual grammatical categories to look at how the text has been constructed in a way to shape how we respond to it. And so what came out of that again is an issue raised earlier, the unique kind of expertise that language people bring to the study of affect. And in this case, certain kinds of meta-language tools of analysis that understand how people are oriented to, away, or towards certain kinds of texts, and what are and a better understanding of the resources. And often, especially in the case, I would say, in additional language teaching, we're kind of, our knowledge base is not treated seriously. So I would venture to guess that no one in affect theory is going to read our paper. Anwar, I'm sorry to say, maybe not, but we will be reading affect theory, and this is kind of like the dark side of transdisciplinarity with less prestigious disciplines in university. And so when I looked at this and then look at our paper, I started to say, yes, there are areas of knowledge generation on our topics that people in other disciplines would, I think, benefit from looking at. Mm-hmm. The expertise of language teachers and linguists, and the unique intercultural spaces that we work in. Mm-hmm. And so that was my comment there. So we've got one last slide to share. Anwar showed me this yesterday. This really gets to this issue of complicating factors by evenly.
You want to continue? It's okay. I mean,
well, this Anwar, you brought. Where did you find this?
Well, I believe it was in the New Yorker magazine.
Okay, very interesting.
Yeah. So I was reading this piece by Yu-Yun Lee, a Chinese American author, and then that was the title of her article. Like, to speak is to blunder. Choosing to renounce a mother tongue. I thought, I mean, I read this paper after writing our own article, right? So it came after, right? So, but this piece made me rethink this whole idea of multilingual or plurilingual identity, and how, like some people are already talking about it, this monolingual approach to multilingualism, right? But the idea here is like we almost take it for granted that multilingualism is a good thing. Probably it is a good thing. I mean, I'm not denying that, but the question about like whether or not we should take a more like a nuanced and more cautious approach to plurilingualism, and because the question is it always a good thing, or for whom it is a good thing, if it is a good thing at all, right? And when we try to assume that everybody wants to maintain and keep their mother tongue, and then everybody loves their mother tongue, and we should promote it. Yes, we should promote it, but at the same time, we need to recognize the fact that for some people, even mother tongue could be, it could bring about some kind of post memories. Probably they want to, they don't want to remember like this, and people might have different reasons to adopt a new language and make it their own language, so close to their heart, emotionally attached, and probably forget a language that they have left when they left that place. So we don't know for sure, like what kind of memories and post memories people are bringing with their language choices. And also, recently I have read some research from Argentina, how a group of scholars are speaking up against this dominant approach of multilingualism and translanguaging, and how they are arguing that this dominant approach of translanguaging and code switching could be detrimental and harmful for some minority languages, because they believe that they need to maintain the distinct character, the distinct identities of their language, because their languages are at risk of extinction. And because always, like when there are multiple languages, we know that some languages are more powerful and more dominant. So the power hierarchy is always there. So these are new, like emerging arguments in the field. And the reason I shared with Brian yesterday about this, like, is just, we did not talk about this in the paper, but I think we need to also think about these kind of issues and just be more cautious about how we promote and valorize a multilingual turn in applied linguistics and second language education in general.
Yeah. I think, Sylvie, we should let people ask questions now. We've got some references here, selected references, but it'd be great to.
Merci. Thank you.
Should I stop the share here? And we
Sure,
can...
and if anybody wants to go back to one slide or another, then you can maybe share again. But right now it would be nice to see all the faces. Thank you very, very, very much for this fascinating talk. It's given me a few ideas that we really have to talk. But other people first. Thank you again. I see at least one hand up from Jennifer. And I've got something to add afterwards, but Jennifer first. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very thought-provoking paper. It's great. I didn't know anything about duoethnography, but I do a lot of discourse analysis, critical discourse analysis, a whole current of research, further developing Bühler in Germany, very, very rich analysis. So this is very, very interesting. So I have two questions. First of all, I want to know how you actually do the analysis. I mean, when I do analysis, I have transcripts, I transcribe multilingual talk. So that is what I use to analyze what I see afterwards. And that's the one thing. And I was thinking, going back to your last remark about the new language erasing the language before, that is so, it provokes so many questions, because of course it depends on the status of the language and the society where you're in at the time, whether the language you're coming from is maybe not so full of status. All these things are going in there. And I'm reminded of a whole project in Germany about teaching mathematics, and to a lot of German students, but a lot of pupils who got Turkish as an L1. And they were finding that although the German was the language being taught in school, and so they were learning mathematics in German, using the loop of using Turkish, although it wasn't that strong, it was a great help for understanding the mathematics in German. So this multilingualism is very, very rich and very important, and people should not think they're erasing their old language with the new language. It's just my remarks. It's very, very interesting paper.
Thank you. Did you want to comment on that, Anwar?
Well, yes. How do you analyze? How do you analyze?
Thank you for this question, Jennifer. Brian, if I can just start with, because I can't help thinking about like how we wrote the paper. It's the experience of writing duoethnography, and when I'm saying writing, Jennifer and everyone else, I'm also implying analysis. Mm-hmm. So again, I mean, Brian will have something because he's more experienced in this methodology than I am. I actually learned it from him. So please add, Brian, later. But for me, I don't see really differences between analysis and writing and thinking. So it almost like everything happens at the same time. And one thing I just wanted to mention is like we used a Google Doc, right? Like because we wrote together, but also like at different times, and then we collaborated on a Google Doc, and all the notes in the margin, I saved our Google Doc at several stages because I did not want to lose our marginal notes, because so many ideas were there that we did not include in our paper. So this coming up with some ideas to include in our paper, we're doing analysis, but at the same time writing in the note as well, commenting on each other's writing and ideas and thinking at the same time, and then meeting, like having Zoom call, and at the same time looking at the Google Doc, because that's our analysis, right? So we're doing analysis at the same time, writing, thinking, talking, and deciding on what ideas we'll include in our paper and what will not include, but maybe for the next project, right? Because those ideas are so rich. And I can certainly tell you that those ideas would not be there if we did not have these duoethnographic exchanges, right? So many new ideas, unexpected, unanticipated ideas came up. So for me, this was a really interesting scholarly experience and analysis. I don't think we did like a traditional discourse analysis. Maybe we had some analysis in our brain, in our head, but when we talked about different signs and different things, like like the bagel world sign that Brian was showing, but it was not the traditional coding based discourse analysis that we did.
I don't mean coding either. Coding is already an interpretation, and that's the whole discussion. I'm not talking about coding, right?
But for us, it was like that, like the analysis was like that. It happened simultaneously.
Okay. I'd love a copy of the paper if it's already published.
Yes, it is published. It is
okay.
published.
I'll write via Sylvie maybe or something. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think Marlon's.
Yeah.
Marlon's done a lot of these too, so I was going to say, and so I'm curious because you've done about 6 or 7 of these too, Marlon. So it's interesting how it'd be to share different processes. As Anwar was saying, we would often start off in a preliminary way with and with Ian, we've done this too in Cooperval, with a Zoom video that we would record. And from that would emerge themes that we would come back to. Why don't we make this a theme of a section? And then so there'd be also this kind of recursive, reiterative process where we would go back and then someone would come up with a reading. I mean, that's the essence of it. You don't want to close off where this is going to go. So you establish what you think would be a relative theme. You think about it earlier, you share your conversations, and then someone will bring in a reading or an idea. And then again, what's really so interesting is that then that conversation starts moving in directions you didn't expect. And that's and I think what the purpose is. Marlon, I'm curious because you've done a lot of these. What's
Yes.
your process?
Okay, well, thank you very much for the presentation of this wonderful duoethnography. I'm still thinking a lot about what Anwar was saying regarding the fact that we should not take for granted a positive association with being multilingual, right? And I was thinking about my negative experiences learning French in Colombia and being trained to be French as an additional language teacher, and how actually after doing my PhD, I came to like fight my demons and reconcile with my French and embrace that I might not be able to write an essay on Balzac, but I can understand and communicate, and that's good enough for me. On the duoethnography, I've done duoethnographies, true ethnographies, multi-ethnographies, and I have to say that the group dynamics vary depending on the group itself. And a lot of things are data, as Anwar was pointing out, like to the margin notes. Like I can tell you the data that we've used in these different projects include voice messages on WhatsApp, Google Docs, Microsoft Office, also like collaborative documents. And if I must also confess this, Brian and Ian, napkin notes under the influence of some refreshments. So, and it's all part of it for sure. And from one great idea, then you have other wonderful ideas that follow. And that is the wonderful thing about multi-ethnographies, I would say. And it puts you in a position of like full trust with your other partners. Like the people that I have collaborated with have been my colleagues and dear friends for many years. And then there's so many things that I've learned about them by collaborating on these projects that I don't think that I would have had the chance to learn otherwise. So it's a wonderful, like very close, intimate, and supportive endeavor. That's how I would describe it.
Merci, Marlon. Thank you. Ian, I think you were next, and then Jennifer.
Well, I just want to congratulate you on a wonderful example of duoethnography in action, full of emotion, full of affect. And I think all of us would agree with Anwar when he says that some of these ideas would never have happened if I didn't have the opportunity of bouncing off you. And that reminds me of something Gregory Bateson said about conversation of this kind. And that is that the participants come in with their own ideas. If they're open, their ideas in tandem with each other will be new ideas that neither of them thought about before, and only come into history because of that conversation. As Marlon says, trust, some refreshment, of course, is necessary, but it brings us back to the role of orality. And if we look at universities, how little experience of horizontal orality, co-constructing ideas in a duoethnographic way, how little that happens, especially in a lecture format. Something to explore. Orality and its role at the university is underappreciated. But my question has to do with my current interest, which is Indigenous language policy in Canada, and the role of post-memory in healing from a century and a half of trauma at the hands of the Canadian state and the Christian churches. I was just at a conference last week, which had as the highlight reflections by Indigenous youth about the transformation that has happened in their lives because of learning their language. And I'll give you one, just as an example, as a taste. This one young girl from Haisla in Kitimat, northern BC, has a grandmother who was a residential school survivor and a first language speaker of Haisla. And she's learning Haisla. Although she, unfortunately, in high school in British Columbia, you have to have a second language officially to graduate in order to present your second language to British Columbian universities. And at the moment, only French is allowed. And she's arguing for an Indigenous language to fulfill that role. Anyway, her grandmother made soup. And at home, they talked Haisla. But once there was a public event in the city, and they were making soup for a number of people. And the young woman asked her grandmother, can you pass me that wooden spoon? And the word for wooden spoon is a Haisla word with deep grandparental significance. And the grandmother did something in a moment that spoke everything about post-memory and trauma. The grandmother first did something that she never did at home. She looked around to see whether there are any white people around. And then she saw some white people and she hesitated, but she said the word in Haisla. Even though she later said that when she spoke that word, the taste of soap came in her mouth because she had been experiencing in residential school, the nuns washed their mouths out with soap if they were caught speaking a second language. So the young girl commented on this. I want to learn my language so that I can heal, that my grandmother can heal, and we can do it in public, not hidden away in private. I take your point that we have to be cautious about foisting one's first language on others, but overwhelmingly, my experience has been that one, that recovering one's self, the self we were supposed to be, that was denied us by the residential school experience, is a healing process. But I think your research is excellent on that, and we need more duoethnography around this question. So many thanks.
Merci, and thank you for that moving personal témoignage. Sorry, I'm all emotional. Jennifer, please.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ian.
That one, okay.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for that, Ian. I also want to say that I really appreciate the mention to orality. And I want to just thank the speakers, because I really feel that this conversation today was very much a dialogue, which is in line with the duoethnography methodology used for your paper. So Brian, I came to know your work about a decade ago. You'd spoken to Andrea Sturzig's class, and I was a master's student at that time, and she was my master's supervisor. And then Anwar, I've been in contact with you over the past few years, and I think it was because I read your critical effective literacies article. I think that was the first entry point into your work. But anyway, that's to say that both of your works have been transformative in shaping my thinking and my pedagogical practices as in the EAP context. And so currently I'm a PhD student at OISE, and because I'm so interested in this affect, I decided to, for my dissertation work, look at spoken word poetry in the EAP context, because spoken word poetry, by its nature of the genre, is very personal, and it's very affective, as in evoking affect and putting the knowledges, or starting with the knowledges of the students. And so over the course of 11 hours, 7 weeks, I worked with an instructor, and we brought this genre into an EAP context. And I think we were amazed at what happened from this, because we had no idea how students would respond to this. And we also took a kind of a translanguaging orientation to our approach to teaching in that space. And so I think, Anwar, you touched a little bit about this, but I think one of my questions, I have two of them, or two things to think about. One of them has to do with the relationship between, affect theory, and I'm drawing on Ahmed's work for my dissertation, as it relates to translanguaging. So that's one thing I'm thinking through now, about those two ideas coming together. And then the second thing is a little bit about what Jennifer said around analysis, but less so on the analysis of your paper of the Duoethnography, which I have read, but more about when doing work and rooting your work in Ahmed's. I'm finding myself struggling, because the dominant discourse of how we think about affect or how we think about emotions is often from that inside out model. That's kind of what's really, really prevalent. And so in analyzing my dissertation work, I find myself being pulled into looking at it in that way. And I have to kind of step back and remember the theoretical orientation of the work that's guiding the way I'm seeing this. And so I don't know, I guess it's more of a thoughts around that, and if you've had any experiences on having to transform the way you're thinking about affect, or maybe even tips of how to enter into that, the approach to analysis as I'm going forward in my work. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jennifer. So I'll start, Brian, and if you have something to add, please feel free. I think I fully agree with Ian, this undermining of orality in the modern academic culture, and also the way we do academic writing. It's almost like we prepare our students as lawyers, like and we prepare them to win the argument all the time, right? And just in a combative mode, like, okay, so my argument is always right. I mean, think about how we teach argumentative essay in our EAP classroom. I mean, yes, we do talk about counter argument, towards the end, like what your opponents might say. But again, like, the point here is to prove that you are always right. Mm-hmm. So for me, that's a problem in this academic writing convention, because it doesn't really help solve some of the great problems that we are encountering, right? So when we teach that mode of writing and thinking, we fail to understand the other person. So academic writing, this evidence-based, carefully thought out academic writing is limiting, I think, in fostering, to foster a culture where we will be open and honest, and we will genuinely try to understand the other, as Ian was talking about, and what that entails, that openness, like folks, like philosophers like Bakhtin, Levinas, Gadamer, they all talked about it. It might sound a cliche, but this dialogue, not in a superficial way, but in a deep, deep way, like, how do we understand you and make myself open to new ideas? I think writing sometimes is not the best method of dialogue and conversation. So orality is great in that sense, but unfortunately we don't get that opportunities in academic writing. But your dissertation research, I'm sure it's going to be great, because you're talking about orality, and then see if you can convince your committee to talk instead of always writing long papers. How about you talk, and your talking will be like an oral dissertation. How about that? So
I love this suggestion.
And yes, writing has some merit, I mean, the permanence of our thoughts, like when Sarah Ahmed talked about shared her great ideas in writing, it's easy for us, it becomes portable, your ideas become portable, and it's some sort of permanence, it's in the book, it's inscribed. But it's not the same in terms of the affective engagement with ideas. It's not the same when you read something and when you feel and speak freely. So yeah, I think this is a really interesting challenge for us to think more. I don't know if folks in affect studies have been thinking about it or talking about it as opposed to writing about it. But let's continue this search and conversation. I'll get in touch if I find something regarding this. But anyone, please feel free to jump in.
I'll just quickly comment on something I just read recently that someone sent me on the generation of empathy through orality, through oral performances. I think it's Aiden and Eschauer, and it's also tied to translingual context. But we've lost the sense of what Ian was talking about, of the structures of feeling that are attached to orality, because we've just been so preoccupied with text. We've even, and only recently paid more attention to the interpretive framework of the participant reader and their historical and embodied reading of the text. So there's the whole orality meaning making resources are really fascinating. And some of the stuff that Anwar and I have been talking about is this dimension of aesthetics that is often lost, that performance generates. And orality tends to be a performative genre more than writing in terms of the writing's permanence or relative permanence. So yeah, I think it's going to be a great dissertation. I have to say I miss being in Regina. It's been a long time. So
I'm in Toronto now. I think that's where you are as well. So
yeah, I am. Don't miss the winters in Regina, but
absolutely, absolutely. Brian, do you mind if I email you after this talk just to get the citation?
Go ahead.
Okay, great.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fiona. I think it will be our last question unless.
So thank you as well very much. I found this talk very interesting on a personal level as a multilingual speaker. This isn't really my area of research, but what you were talking about and what a few other people have said, it got me thinking about, and I don't know if this really relates to affect and memory and post-memory, but the layering of languages. So in what order they're learned and in what contexts they're learned. And the reason I'm thinking about this is, for me, the way that I learned my languages, one was learned as a child, and now I don't really use that language anymore, but it does still play into my other understandings because sometimes I have to mediate through that language. So I'm wondering if that's sort of something, another sort of area to explore would be context and layering of what the chronology. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I mean, that's what came up in my duoethnography, thinking about this work by Rosowski of different literacies. And another case was working in a Chinese community center and teaching China for a year. The specific deliberative ways in which stroke order, the acquisition of literacy, so unique to that identity. Or I remember when Ian took us to the language museum in Havana and seeing the physicality of those kids learning to write their first alphabet, those children, everything, posture. So these kinds of things, I think they're really embedded in your memory. The physicality, the routine, the process, and maybe in some ways that's how we learn. That's the foundation from which we move on to expand what we acquire is that foundation. And so you're right, stuff that we learned way back as children, literacy practices and language practices come back.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Fiona, for this question. Probably we won't have enough time to talk in detail about this, but recently I have written a book chapter, and in which I talk. It's not a duoethnography. I wish it were, but in which I talked about emotional geography of languages. And I tried to develop this concept and relate to multilingual identity in Canadian context. So it's not published yet, but I have the draft if you're interested. Now,
or we can have another noon talk on this.
Oh, so thank you. So this idea of how the traces of place is almost erased from our linguistic identity. So, and because so many people move from place to place and learn the language of that place, like the dominant language of that place, let's say, or it doesn't have to be dominant, but any language. Because how can we conceptualize and remember a language and our experience of learning that language without thinking and feeling that place, that location, that tangible, that physicality of the language? So that's why I developed this idea of emotional geography of language, and think about all the people who are coming to Canada, and then we're kind of, trying to nurture and support the language, which is good, language and culture, but what about the place? And then I borrowed this idea of topophilia from a geographer, Wisconsin-based geographer in the 1960s, 70s, topophilia. So our love for place, and our attachment for all the places that we have lived and left behind, the place that we're currently occupying, and probably the places that we aspire to go in the future. So this physical journey and our footprint on the places. So this relationship between language and place and our identity. So this is something I try to articulate in this notion of emotional geography of languages. Maybe another time we can talk more about it. I'm mindful of the time here.
Well, I'll get back to you. As I said, you gave me a lot of ideas here. I think we've got a whole program for a whole year. Marlon.
Just a quick comment. When I was doing data collection for my doctoral dissertation, I had a young teacher candidate who identified as Palestinian, and then in her autobiographical creation that I asked her to produce for my data collection, she put a picture of the Dome of the Rock. And when we talked about her strong Palestinian identity, even though she hadn't even visited, she said this to me: Palestinians don't need a country because the country is in our hearts.
Beautiful. Yeah, indeed. Anwar, would you like to comment on this? We were talking about home and language.
Well, that statement was so profound. Maybe we should take an affective approach instead of a logocentric to talk about that. What Marlon said, like, just, I think that was enough.
Well, I guess we'll end this session on this profound quote. Thank you, Marlon, and thank you very much, everyone. And a special thought, Brian, for your Ukrainian background at the moment. I think we all want to share this. I will. Brian and Anwar, could you stay behind after this talk? I've got a few ideas that I'd like to share with you, if you don't mind, for CRLCC and other events. That would be lovely if you were to share my thoughts. Merci à tous. Thank you very much. We have a research festival coming up soon, we hope. and also FSL and French, well, global competencies and French as a second and first language study day coming up soon too. So hopefully I'll see some of you there. Merci à tous. Bonne journée. Enjoy the snow if you're in Toronto. Et merci.
Merci Sylvie.
Au
Merci.
revoir.
Merci.
Thank you,
you very
everybody.
much.
Thank you, everybody,
Bye.
for
Thank you.
coming to.
Super
your talk.
interesting. Super
Thanks.
interesting.
Thank you.